I have to say, I feel I feel a little bit, how do I put this? A little bit ambiguous when I say this, because the convention is to say I should pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. But according to all of the historical, I've done a little bit of historical research into the Barramadigal people, and I don't think that there are any left. Like I think that they're entirely wiped out. So that's always something that I feel weird about when I say emerging. Like, I'm sure that there are lost peoples, and I'm sure that there are people around that they don't disappear without trace. But as far as history says, that there are no surviving members of the Barramadigal clan. Okay, so anyway, moving on. So last week we began our discussion of the early Buddhist theory of knowledge. This week I will begin with a very brief recap. We learned a few technical terms, epistemology and ontology, and a few things like that. And we looked at the historical context within which the Buddha was teaching. And we looked a little bit at the different kinds of traditions that were around at the time, the Vedic tradition, the Jains, and so on. And each of those traditions has a way of learning and a way of coming to know things. Now, you know, obviously this is a huge field and we could only skip over that very briefly, but we did learn a little bit about what that background is. And I think, you know, it's something that I've always emphasized and I think is crucially important to understanding the Dhamma, and especially to understanding the suttas. If you have an interest in the suttas, like, you know, I know a lot of people, if they've been reading suttas and they want to expand their knowledge, then maybe they want to study Abhidhamma, or they want to study the Visuddhimagga or something like that. And if you want to study those things, that's fine. But far more interesting and far more useful than any of those things is to study the Upanishads, especially the early Upanishads, the Brihadaranyaka and Chandogya Upanishads. And the lack of knowledge and understanding of those things, in my view, is one of the major sources of shallowness in people's reading and understanding of the suttas. In addition to the fact that especially those two, the Brihadaranyaka and Chandogya Upanishads, are beautiful to read, and they have a lot of really nice passages there. Anywho, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about those things, because the topic for today is going to go over a lot of the same ground again. So we can get a bit of a review just by doing today's work as well. So we're going to cover today chapters 4 and 5. For those of you who are not up with this, and I think that the Buddhist Library hopefully is sending out the class questions, but if not, you can find it on our discourse forum. If you look for the course there, you'll find a summary of the content for each of the classes. So for today, we're going to cover chapters 4 and 5, the attitude to authority and the attitude to reason. Once again, we are not going to attempt to give a thorough and detailed explanation of each of these chapters, but we are just going to lightly touch on them, give a bit of an overview, and hopefully to give you enough of a perspective to be able to take up the reading and to go deeper into it. We're all in lockdown, so you've got plenty of time, and I'm just going to say it, you're running low on excuses. So if you haven't got around to doing something, if you're not going to get around to doing something boring now, you'll never get around to doing it. So it's certainly not going to happen after lockdown. All right. Let us begin, and I'll just begin by reading some chapters from Jayantilekha, and from beginning with section number 244. And Jayantilekha, I have to say, one of the things I love about this book is that he numbers the paragraphs. Numbered paragraphs, ladies and gentlemen, excellent, okay? When we tried to classify the thinkers of the pre-Buddhistic era in accordance with their epistemological outlook and approach to problems, we found in chapter 1 that the Vedic thinkers up to the time of Buddhism seemed to fall into 3 groups. Firstly, there were the traditionalists, coming down from the period of the Brahmanas, who considered the sacred scriptures to be the most valuable source of knowledge. Secondly, There were the thinkers of the Aranyakas and early Upanishads who, while not entirely discarding the scripture, thought that knowledge of reality was possible by reasoning and metaphysical speculation. While this second school of thinkers would have continued independently to evolve their own speculative theories, there arose thirdly the contemplatives of the middle and late Upanishads who, while relegating scripture to the realm of lower knowledge and discarding reason as an adequate means of obtaining knowledge of reality, claimed that the only means of knowing reality was by having a direct personal and direct acquaintance and experience of it, by practicing meditative techniques and depending on the grace of God for the final vision or revelation. So 3 basic forms of knowledge: tradition, reason, and direct experience through meditation. Okay, so these are the 3, and we're going to be coming back to these through the course. A study, that was regarding the Vedic teachers. Okay, so that's from the Brahmanical traditions. Now, a study of the ways of knowing of the non-Vedic thinkers. So this means the Brahmins. This means the Jains, the Ajivikas, and so on. So all of the followers of the different Shramana sects who are outside of the fold of the Brahmins. The study of the ways of knowing of the non-Vedic thinkers shows that they can be classified along with the second and third groups of the Vedic thinkers. And that's an important point to make. At the time of the Buddha, there is no evidence of scripture among the non-Vedic schools. In other words, another way of saying the same thing is that out of all of the Shramana schools, all of the sort of rebel ascetic schools, the Buddhism is the first one of which we have any scripture. Okay, Jainism had scripture from around the same time, maybe a bit earlier, a bit later, but basically Buddhism is the oldest one. So when the suttas are talking about scripture and scriptural authority, they're always referring to the Brahmanical tradition. That's the only kind of scriptural authority that they knew about. Okay. A study of the ways of knowing of the non-Vedic thinkers shows that they can be classified along with the second and third groups of Vedic thinkers. There is little doubt that the materialists made use of reason, both in evolving as well as propagating their views through reason. For them was on the whole subservient to perception. The skeptics likewise seem to have reasoned their way into skepticism, though with the exception of the school of Sanjaya, they made little use of it since they kept aloof from controversy. The school of Sanjaya, of course, being the teacher of Sariputta and Moggallana. And his teaching was more or less, if you say it's like this, I don't say it is, but I don't say it's not. And if you say it's like that, I also don't say it is, and I don't say it's not. And I don't say it both is and is not, nor do I say it neither is nor is not. So anyway, the Ajivikas were a mixed lot. They were primarily rational metaphysicians and dialecticians, though some of them seem to have claimed personal intuitional insights. Ajivikas, incidentally, are one of those many schools which has kind of disappeared from the Indian scene, although they had a presence there for many hundreds of years. We find, for example, that King Ashoka is dedicating caves to the Ajivikas. So they were clearly a major kind of movement. And the standard modern work on the Ajivikas was done by a professor called Basham at ANU, as it happens. So go Australia. So if you want to know more about the Ajivikas, then what is called the History and Doctrine of the Ajivikas or something like that, I think in the 60s. Okay, similarly, the Jains, or at least their leader, claimed personal and direct knowledge of things while making use of reason in debate. If therefore we take the pre-Buddhistic now paragraph 46, 246, if therefore we take the pre-Buddhistic background of thought as a whole, so synthesizing the Vedic and non-Vedic, these thinkers fall into 3 classes according to the stress they laid upon a particular way of knowing. So one of the things that Jayatileka is showing here is that this problem of knowing, how do we know what we think we know? This was a problem that was not invented by the Buddha. He was not the first person for whom this was a concern. It might have been treated more systematically by the Buddha. But clearly, before the Buddha's time, these distinctions can be discerned. And one of the things that Jayatileka is showing through these chapters is that he's showing that, number one, that these concerns are there, especially these three main groups, the traditionalist, the rationalist, and the experientialist. Secondly, he's showing that they are present both in the Buddhist scriptures as well as in the source scriptures of those schools, so far as we have them. Okay, so what that means is that one of the things that it does is that tells us that the Buddhist description of those schools is by and large accurate, because we say those things of them, the suttas say of them that they're like that, and their scriptures also say the same thing. Right? So this is, while investigating the ways of knowledge, we're also testing the ways of knowledge as we go along. So those things are useful. And the third thing is by looking at and critiquing the manner in which these ways of knowing are handled in the different schools, we are preparing the groundwork to position where the Buddha stands in regards to these things. And I hope this is not a spoiler, but spoiler alert, the Buddha gave due weight and consideration to all of these kinds of knowledge, but did not regard either scriptural authority or reason as being a final word, but as being an important part that was leading to insight which arose from direct experience. All right, so let's have a look at from back to 246. The traditionalists derive their knowledge wholly from a scriptural tradition and interpretations based on it. Prominent in this class were the Brahmins, who upheld the sacred authority of the Vedas, the rationalists, who derive their knowledge from reasoning and speculation without any claims to extrasensory perception or meditative insight, I should say. The metaphysicians of the early Upanishads, the skeptics, materialists, and most of the Ajivikas fell into this class. Then there is the experientialists, who depended on direct personal knowledge and experience, including extrasensory perception, on the basis of which their theories were founded. Many of the thinkers of the middle and late Upanishads, some of the Ajivikas and Jains, were classifiable in this group. The materialists, as empiricists, would also fall under this category, if not for the fact that they denied the validity of claims to extrasensory perception. Okay, so I'm not entirely convinced by Jayatileka's emphasis on extrasensory perception here, although we will learn more about exactly what he means by this as time goes on. But I think it's the most important contribution that he made in this area was to show that for Buddhism, extrasensory perception, for example, the power of clairvoyance or recollecting past lives and so on, was not something which was regarded as completely separate from and other than sense perception. In other words, it was regarded as a developed and refined form of sense perception through the mind. So it's not a metaphysical kind of knowledge, but rather a form of refined empirical knowledge. Okay. Jayatileka then in paragraph 247 goes on to qualify this. This classification, however, should not be too rigidly interpreted so as to consider these groups as mutually exclusive. Such was not the case, for the traditionalists did not deny or fail to give place to perception and reason. The rationalists of the early Upanishads likewise did not entirely do away with scripture, although the materialists did. The Ajivikas and later the Jains also had their scriptures which they held in great respect. The experientialists of the middle and late Upanishads in like manner gave a very limited place to scripture, though they discard reason altogether. So what we can claim for this grouping is that when we consider the epistemological standpoints of these groups as a whole, the essential or final knowledge claimed by them is said to be derived mainly, if not wholly, from each of the sources of knowledge emphasized by each group. So in examining the ways of knowledge recognized, it would be pertinent to ask whether the Buddha or early Buddhism can be classified under any of the above groups, or to see what attitude Buddhism adopted towards them. Now, in paragraph 249, Jayatilleka goes on to discuss the Sangharava Sutta. So the Sangharava Sutta is Majjhima Nikaya number 100, for those of you who want to check this as we're going. Actually, there's like half a dozen Sangharava Suttas, but this is the one that we are looking at. And the Sangharava Sutta talks about, there the Buddha is talking with a Brahmin who is versed in the Vedas and Vedic law, who asks him the following question. There are some recluses and Brahmins who profess the basis of a religion, of a spiritual path, brahmacharya, after finding a final and ultimate insight in this life. Dirtha Dhamma Bhinya Vosana Parami Patta. Okay, now on this compound, the first term in the compound is an important one, is Dirtha Dhamma. And this idiom is found very commonly in the suttas, along with a number of related idioms. And it's not always entirely obvious exactly what it means. Dirtha means visible, what is seen, and Dhamma means, well, many things. So what does Dirtha Dhamma mean? And here Jayatilleka has translated it quite correctly by saying it means in this life. Okay, so it's one of these idioms that, if you translate it over literally, is easy to mistake. So you could say it has insight among visible phenomena. All right, Dirtha literally means seen. So you could translate it among what is seen, among visible phenomena, or something like that. But what it means is in this life. It's the same meaning as Sandirtika, which we have in our chanting for the recollection of the Dhamma. Sandirtiko means in this very life. Akaliko also means in this very life. Anantarika, which we find in the Ratna Sutta, Samadhimanantarikanyamahu, also has the same meaning. It means in this very life. So all of these are idioms that are talking about the fact that the Dhamma is something that we can experience here and now. We can experience in this life, i.e., we don't have to wait until we die and go to heaven or whatever to see the results of our practice. So that's a relief. Okay, so this is what the Dirtha Dhamma means. Okay. Now, where does Venerable Gautama stand among these? And also, you know, this is something that I keep on mentioning in talking about the suttas. One of the unique and extremely interesting characteristics of the suttas is that they are constantly engaged in interreligious dialogue. And here is just one of countless examples. The Buddha was not living in a Buddhist country. He was not debating solely with other Buddhists. He debated with a wide range of people. Yes, other Buddhists. Yes, questioning people. Yes, people who had no beliefs. Yes, people who had very strong beliefs in other paths. All kinds of people. And he debated with all kinds of people all the time. And that's one of the things that gives the most kind of liveliness and interest to me of the suttas. And that's something you don't find in any later literature. And I'm not aware of any later literature in Buddhism at all, which involves discussion with non-Buddhists, certainly not anything like on this kind of scale. So here, as normal, as so often, the Buddha talking with other people different than him. It's really important. If you're just talking with people who are the same as you all the time, life just gets so very boring. Oh my God, how can people stand it? I don't know. Anyway, and the Buddha's replies, I say that there is different among those who profess the basis of a religion after finding a final and ultimate insight in this life. So among those who say we can realize the Dhamma in this very life, there are still differences. Some who say we can do it on the basis of tradition, anusavika. these, such as the Brahmins of the three Vedas. There are some who say we can profess the base of religion after finding a final insight based on mere belief, such as the reasoners and metaphysicians, Vimamsa and Taki. There are others who say we can find an ultimate insight on the personally after realizing the Dhamma, right? Samanyeva. Now, I am one of those who profess the basis of religion after finding a final and ultimate insight in this life by gaining a higher knowledge personally of a doctrine among doctrines, a Dhamma among Dhammas, not traditionally heard of before. Okay, so in other words, the Buddha here is identifying himself with the third group, the experientialists. One of the interesting details of this particular passage is the phrase right at the end of Jatileka's translation there, not traditionally heard of before. The Pali for that is pubesu ananusutesu dhammesu. And those of you, many of you may hopefully be familiar with that phrase in Pali, pubesu ananusutesu dhammesu, because it's one of the phrases repeated like a refrain in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, in the Buddha's first sermon. One of the first things he comes out and says, I became enlightened by realizing these things, pubesu ananusutesu dhammesu, that were not heard before from an oral tradition, anusava. Now, it took me a while to actually realize that that's what the Dhammacakka was saying. Originally, I thought that that line meant that that these were teachings that no one had heard of before, right? That these were kind of new teachings, fresh teachings. And obviously that's not wrong, right? I mean, the Buddha's, it's obviously that's true to say that of the Dhamma, but it's not quite precisely what that line is saying. Anusutta means hearing one from the other, down in a tradition, learning down from an oral tradition. And so the Anusutta specifically is the Vedic and oral tradition. He's saying this is not something I learned. This is something that I've realized for myself. Actually, it's almost the same really as when the Buddha, before the Dhammacakka, when he met the Ajivaka Upaka, and he said, Acharyo me nati, I have no teacher. And it's really, basically, it's saying the same thing. Okay. So another interesting thing about this passage is that here we find the Buddha using a similar scheme of threefold classification that Jayatileka worked out as well. So that idea that we can divide ways of knowing in religious circles into these three primary ways is something we actually find in the suttas. The traditionalists, the rationalists, and the experientialists. And for this class, we're looking primarily at the first two of those, the traditionalists and the rationalists. Okay. So I'm going to take a break in a minute for some questions. So that's, I'm just going to, oops, sorry about that. I'm just going to power on for the moment. So Jayatileka goes on to have a fairly lengthy discussion of the knowledge of tradition inside different schools of Vedic philosophy, but I'm going to skip over those and go forward to paragraph number 259. We stated that of the 10 possible ways of claiming knowledge criticized by the Buddha, 6, so this is the 10 things which are probably most familiar to you by they're found in the Kalama Sutta, actually found a number of times in the suttas, but most famously in the Kalama Sutta. So 6 out of those 10 had reference to the acceptance of authority, which are Anusavena, Paramparaya, Itikiraya, Pitika Sampadaya, Bhavya Rupataya, and Samano no Garu. And Jayatileka goes on to discuss all of these types. I'm going to, I might actually just summarize this, because one of the things that Jayatileka does in the next few chapters is he looks at what various scholars have argued in the past and have and gives various critiques and discussions of what they've done. And so that's probably a little bit of a byway for our purposes. So I might just stick with that list of the different things and just give you, just going to give a bit of an explanation for each one of those. So this explanation that I'm going to give now is my own explanation based on my own, experience and reasoning and what have you, my own knowledge of tradition, my own investigation, inquiry, and so on, which has largely been informed by Jayatilaka's findings, although in a few places I might differ just a little bit from what he says, but mostly in a similar way. So the first one is that he says, first one here is anusava. Okay, so this is anu meaning along or following, and sava to hear along. In other words, to hear from another. In other words, an oral tradition. And so we've already heard that this is applied, well, it might be a general term, but in the suttas, it's applied specifically of the Brahmins and the Brahmanical traditions. Now, one of the things about an oral tradition is that it really does mean hearing it from another, like a teacher and a student would sit down and the teacher would recite and the student would learn and recite it back. And you go back and forth like that until you get it right. That's what it means. It doesn't mean like that there's a, it's just like something that you've heard of or anything like that. There's like a specific means of transmitting this. And the Vedic teachers believed or claimed to believe that their scriptures, at least the oldest of their scriptures, were spoken by Brahma himself. That is to say that they were the word of God, and that the lineage and transmission of that was unbroken and uncorrupted. Now, one of those claims has a good basis in truth, and that is the claim that their transmission was very accurate and reliable. And all of the linguistic investigations of the Vedas does affirm that the Vedas include a lot of extremely archaic linguistic forms, a lot of extremely archaic references and so on, which attests to the fact that long before, like hundreds or thousands of years before they were written down, that they were passed down very reliably anusavena, through an oral tradition. So there's no particular evidential basis to suspect that an oral tradition in and of itself was an unreliable source of information. The problem becomes with the second of the Vedic claims, which is that these things were spoken by God. And of course, that's not something that the Buddha would concur with. Jayatilaka actually makes this point a little bit further down in, where are we now? Paragraph number, I'm not sure if I can find the paragraph again now. Paragraph number 275. The Buddha does not prima facie appear to be averse to the idea of basing the reality of Brahman on Vedic authority, provided a valid claim to a real personal knowledge of Brahma was made by at least one of the teachers on whom this tradition was based. The criticism made here is that the Vedic tradition as such is not and cannot claim to be a revelation. It's not a denial of the possibility of revelation, although, of course, the admission of such a possibility would be incompatible with the non-theistic characteristic of Buddhism. So in other words, the problem here is not that the transmission itself is unreliable, but that no one even within the tradition is claiming that they've had a revelation from God, or that even their teachers have had revelations from God. And so the Buddha very famously used the simile of a line of blind men, one following the other, which, obviously didn't endear him to the Brahmins. Okay, so this is anusava. And I think it's important to make that point, because exactly the opposite argument is often made today about the oral tradition. Today, people will argue oral tradition, you can't rely on it. You can look in the suttas and you say, oh, the Buddha said not to rely on an oral tradition. That's true. But the reason why the Buddha said not to rely on it is quite different. So people today say you shouldn't rely on oral tradition because oral tradition is inherently unreliable and the transmission cannot be guaranteed. There's no empirical evidence to that effect. On the contrary, we have a lot of empirical evidence that the oral tradition is no more or less reliable than any other means of transmission. And as a general principle in this area, the reliability of the transmission of a text is primarily determined not by the medium of transmission, but by the care and diligence of the people doing the work. Okay, so that's the Anusava. Next one, Parampara. So again, Jayatileka has a bit of a discussion of this. Now, parampara means succession, it means one after the other. And Jayatileka, it's normally taken to mean a succession of teachers, as in a teacher's lineage. Jayatileka argues that it could also mean a succession of the teaching, which, given that the teachers were, you know, the bearers of the teaching, the difference is purely a nominal one, really. The notion of parampara has become exceedingly important in Buddhism, and it can be that importance can be traced back at least as old as the Parivara. Parivara is an appendix to the Pali Vinaya, and it was written in Sri Lanka maybe 300 or 400 years after the Buddha, and it contains one of the oldest, if not one of the, contains one of the oldest, if not the oldest, list of a parampara, a lineage of teachers found in Buddhism. And one of the curious details about that is, of course, we don't find anything like that in the early Buddhist texts, nor do we find the Buddha saying that the lineage of teachers should be established or given any importance or credence to that idea whatsoever. But we also find that a close examination of that parampara reveals that it was actually copied from the form of it was copied from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. That is to say that the early Buddhists got their inspiration for the idea of scriptural, of lineage of teachers from Brahmanical scriptures and not from Buddhist scriptures. Personally, I find the idea of parampara to be an extremely dangerous one. And this is because of my observation of how spiritual communities work. It is extremely common, if not absolutely normal, that students will claim parampara and claim authority of a lineage from a teacher on the grounds of complete rubbish. And we even talked about this a bit last week when we discussed the question of whether Jayatileka himself could be considered a student of Wittgenstein, and we're not actually sure how many of his classes he went to, whether Wittgenstein personally instructed him and what nature of their dialogue was or anything like that. So sure, you know, Jayatileka went to some of the classes, but we don't really know much more than that, and yet it's easy to make that claim. And this is the kind of thing we find constantly. And when you're within the traditions, this is something that's griped about all the time. And I know that there are a number, for example, of American Buddhist teachers who would say in their books that they were like a student of Ajahn Chah, and the monks in the Ajahn Chah tradition would say they only came down here for 2 weeks, and then they caused all of this problem, and nobody liked them, and then they left, and now they're claiming they're a student of Ajahn Chah. And this kind of thing happens like all the time. So this is why I think the Buddha did not talk about parampara as an important factor in finding knowledge. And I think that we need to be very, very cautious and skeptical about any claims to lineage. Okay. Paramparaya, itikiraya. Now, itikiraya is a somewhat more interesting one. Literally, itikiraya means so it seems. Iti means so, and it's used for quotations, right? So iti means quotation, thus. So it's like talking about, oh, such and such. Kira, so they say, that's what they think, is it? There's a rumor to that effect, right? So iti kiraya means, there's a rumor to that effect. And Jayatileka has this discussion about the relationship between iti kira and other related terms we find in suttas, such as itihasa and itihitiha. and without going into all of the details about this, but it seems that what these are referring to is some kind of transmission or oral sort of oral teachings that are of a less sort of specified and concrete type than anusava. So the anusava is literally, hearing it and then repeating the same thing in a letter by letter form. Itikira is probably best described as legends, stories, folk tales. Sometimes itihasa is said to be also the Mahabharata. So remembering Mahabharata at that time, the Mahabharata that we have today was edited much later and put together much later, but based on, of course, a body of legend and story and mythology, which goes back for many hundreds of years. And so this more loose body of knowledge, which, surely the Jatakas also drew upon. And the Jatakas contain some of the earliest versions of the Mahabharata and Ramayana in Indian literature. We find there's Buddhist versions of many of those stories earlier than there are Hindu versions. And so this itikira is like the legends of the past, the stories that have come down. They might be, they're not like established within a particular school with a sort of a regular teacher-student relationship, but you think they're more kind of things that you hear around the fireside and all of these kinds of things. I mean, if you like, I just gave you a little story about how when I was a young monk in Nanachat, and the monks would say, "Oh, this would happen and that would happen." Well, that's kind of like itikira, right? It's not like a formal teaching that I'm passing down, but it's an account of what's happened in the past. So itikiraya, it is kind of the extent to which we rely on itikira is also very still very strong today. And for people within communities that have a history together, the itikira tells the story that gives those people meaning. It's a story that we can tell ourselves as part of a community that can help to define who we are as a people. And so these stories and legends and so on, then they tend to be often dismissed by rationalist and modernist Buddhists, who we think that we're scientific. We think that we're about knowing what the facts are. We think we're about empirical reality. And we tend to dismiss these itikiras. And of course, it's true that if you want to take that as a literal description of events in the past, then you're probably going to be mostly disappointed, not to say that they can't include some factual information, but that's not really their main purpose. So one of the things that I've tried to do is to try to talk a lot more about Buddhist mythology and about how storytelling informs us with a sense of meaning. It tells us about who these people thought that they were, how they identified themselves, and not just how people identify themselves, but how they build up and create, how they form a sense of community through the stories that they tell each other. So this is the itikira. And, in brief, I would say itikira is really interesting and useful for getting a sense of meaning, but not so useful for getting facts. But both of those things are important. The next one of the 6 is, so we've had anusava, which is oral tradition. Parampara is a lineage. Itikira is legends and storytelling. Pitaka sampadaya, because Pitaka sampadaya means literally included in the Pitaka. In the early texts, we only find Pitaka used in this sense. So in other words, we don't find the idea of the Tipitaka as collections of Buddhist texts. So they were included from others. So clearly there was, if you can say something is referenced or something's included in the Tipitaka, therefore in the Pitaka, therefore it must be true. And of course, even though this was said of non-Buddhist schools, obviously it's equally true of Buddhist schools. And, we can't say that just because something's included in the Pitaka, that therefore it must be true. There are things in the Pitaka that are not true. They talk about, Pitaka talks about things like sea monsters that are hundreds of miles long, and mountains that are thousands of miles high, and various kinds of things that we know simply are not true. So we can't just point to things in the suttas, in the Vinaya, or anywhere else and say because it's there, therefore it must be true. Again, it doesn't mean that it's false, but it just means that that's not by itself a valid form of knowledge. Okay, the next one, bhavya rupataya. Bhavya rupataya. And bhavya rupataya means something like seemingly competent. Okay, so bhavya means competent, capable. Rupa often has a meaning of appearing or seeming. So bhavya rupataya means the appearance of competence. And this is also a really good one because this is something that you see around yourself. Like we see this constantly in terms of how knowledge is packaged. And I saw a meme once that we can now say how reliable knowledge is based on the you have a kind of spectrum. On the first one, you have a TikTok, then you have a YouTube, and then a web page, and then a Word doc, and then a PDF. So if it's in a PDF, it must be true. Okay, and then there's a kind of spectrum of reliability based on file types. So you can even see that today. And that idea of presenting an apparent competence is a really kind of interesting thing. When I was in Malaysia, I had problems with my knee, and I would sometimes go to see different Chinese doctors who would massage it or give me some smelly paste mixed with sesame oil to put on it, or whack it with chopsticks to make it go away, and all these kinds of things. One of the things that I've kind of really noticed about seeing these fellows is that, they're just working at home. They're working in some kind of fairly crappy little studio or something like that. And they made no kind of attempt to actually appear competent. And it was really kind of interesting, the difference from going to a Western doctor where, you have a surgery, you're wearing kind of a white coat, and you have, things on the wall with your degrees and qualifications and all of these kinds of trappings of authority that convey an impression. And it's quite deliberate, right? You do this thing quite deliberately to convey an impression that you are competent. And, again, it's not bad in and of itself, right? It's just not reality, of course, because sometimes people can spend more effort to conveying a sense of competence rather than in actually being competent. So this is what bhavya rupataya is. And it's just important to understand as just as a kind of humility for ourselves, just to remember that we can't always tell, and that sometimes the most persuasive people can be not actually kind of as competent as we thought. So how do we tell the difference between somebody who is actually competent and someone who appears competent? If you're having a discussion? Not easy. Well, we maybe can talk about this later, maybe in the group breakout session. It's an interesting one, but here's my tip. Number one, if somebody can't admit when they make a mistake, then there's no point in continuing the conversation. Simple as that. It's impossible. You can't have a rational conversation with somebody who can't admit they made a mistake. All right, moving on. Next one, samano no garu, means the monk, our monk is respected, a respected teacher. And again, we can see this one is very common in Buddhism these days, right? So people will say, oh, I'm a student of so-and-so or so-and-so, or this Ajahn Chah says this, or Ajahn Venerable Nyanananda says this, or Venerable Ajahn Brahm says that, or something like that, and then you can have a discussion based on throwing your heavyweight monks around to see who can squash the opposition based on the greatest level of authority. And this obviously is kind of silly. And I remember again to share with you a little bit of itikira. When I was at Thailand, I was like maybe in my first or second reigns, and we were staying at a little branch monastery called Pujam Kom, and Pujam Kom it must be my third rains retreat, third Vasa, I think. Anyway, and Pujam Kom was just a tiny little place right at the end of nowhere, like literally on the easternmost point of the whole of Thailand. We're on the Mekong River overlooking the jungles of Laos, and very, very simple and so on. And Ajahn Pasano, who was then the abbot of Wat Nanachat, came out for a visit. And that time we had a couple of long-term either Mechi or Upasikas, I can't quite remember now, maybe Mechi or anyway, in the kitchen or staying in the monastery, and they used to cook for us. And they had been at Wat Bapong at Ajahn Chah's monastery during the time that he was alive, and so had Ajahn Pasano, and he'd been a direct student of Ajahn Chah and had been around at the same time. And so these Mechi had got into the habit. So in one of the rules of the Vinaya that is observed by strict Vinaya monks is a rule called Gapyang Korohi, where when you have some fruit with seeds in it, you have to stab the fruit to make sure that it's dead. I won't go into the whole basis of it. It actually comes from a Jain belief about the living creatures. Anyhow, and so normally what we would do is we would have like a whole bowl of fruit, and then you just touch it with a knife, and then you say Gapyang Korohi, and then that's done. But what they were doing is that they were serving cherry tomatoes, and they would slice each cherry tomato in half. And they'd say that Ajahn Chah said you had to slice each cherry tomato in half in order to make it Gapyang Korohi, to make it allowable. And they said that's what Ajahn Chah did. That's what Ajahn Chah said. You have to do it like that. And I remember just Ajahn Pasano just kind of laughing. He said, I'm not going to touch that one. He said, that's fine. They want to slice the tomatoes, let them slice the tomatoes. And this is, of course, the problem with that samano no garu, because people have different memories of what somebody said and different interpretations. And teachers get things wrong sometimes, or they get things taken out of context, or things misunderstood. And so relying purely on the authority of a teacher is also not a final word as to what wisdom is. And, you find this is kind of something, if you say, if you say something that differs from what some teacher says, then you're like, what, you're saying that they're wrong? Well, I'm just trying to, I'm not trying to attack anyone. I'm just trying to find out what the truth is. But it becomes very important in Buddhism because people's sense of reality depends on the idea that there are certain teachers who are enlightened. And as enlightened masters, they have some direct connection with reality. And so what they're teaching to you has some kind of absolute truth to it. And so the words spoken by monks and by anyone who's in that position in Buddhism becomes massively overdetermined, and becomes so personal, because it's not just, you notice like in this particular phrase, this is the only one that has like a personal pronoun in it. Samano no garu. Yeah, it's our ascetic, right? It's a personal relationship. It's not just a tradition or something, but this monk that we look up to. And so when you disagree with it, it becomes a personal challenge to their sense of identity and so on. Now, of course, personally challenging your sense of identity is good. That's how we get rid of our sense of conceit and our sense of self. But it's kind of hard also. And again, to just do a bit of itikira for you, well, many years ago when I was at Bodhinyana with Ajahn Brahm, there was a visiting Thai monk there. And this Thai monk had a kind of a reputation for being, having advanced meditation and all of these kinds of things. And there was one monk there who was a very, very diligent scholar, and he was a German monk. He had like really thick glasses. And what he did was that he quite literally had like a list of more than 100 Dhamma questions that he would accumulate, and then he would send out these questions to people, to teachers all around the world, getting them to answer it. He sent it to Bhante Ajahn Thanissaro, to Bhante Gunaratana, to Helmut Hecker in Germany, and sent all of these lists. I remember Thanissaro wrote back and said, if you can just tell me which one of these is going to stop you from being an arahant, then I'll see if I can answer those ones. And so various people gave him various answers. But anyway, so he came along and was asking, sat down in front of him, ready to ask his questions. And the teacher said something to the translator, and the translator says, "Oh, I can see you're a smart guy." And because he had his glasses on, he had his book, and he's ready to answer his questions. "Oh, I can see, he's being kind of positive and supportive." So immediately he looks up and says, "What? Did you see something? Did you see something?" And so the most, "Oh no," he says, "I'm just saying, just passing a remark." And so sometimes they're very kind of small or offhand things that you might say that are actually meant, quite casually, quite lightly, get taken to mean something that they're not. So this is what happens with Samano no Garu. All right, and I'm just going to, we're going to wrap up this first part of it in just a second. But I'm just going to briefly check. I've got these paragraphs noted down for discussing these sections. Obviously, Jayati Lekha goes into a lot more detail, especially as to how these are related to the Vedic traditions. Yeah, so I don't need to do that. Okay, good. All right. But I've skipped over a lot of that, and I've skipped over a lot of his discussion of the different kinds of the different opinions among different scholars and so on. That would take a little bit too long. All right, I will go ahead now to section number 310. Where Jayati Lekha discusses the question of omniscience. And this comes back to the question of authority, and again, related to that Samano no Garu idea, because if you believe that your teacher is omniscient, then, well, it would make sense to accept what they say. Let's see what Jayati Lekha has to say here. Another form which the criticism of the acceptance of authority has taken in Buddhism is perhaps the denial of omniscience. One of the religions criticized as unsatisfactory is that which is claimed to be based on the omniscience of the teacher. The claim to omniscience is defined as follows. And so here is quoting from the Majjhima Nikaya. Herein, a certain teacher claims infinite knowledge and vision as being omniscient and all-seeing, saying that when he walks or stands still, when he's asleep or awake, there is knowledge and vision present to him constantly and continually. This is criticized on the assumption that no person can be omniscient in this sense. The assumption is not that of the theist, who would argue that God alone is omniscient, but not any created being, since omniscience is denied of Brahma as well. Brahma is not omniscient, despite what he and those who revere him believe, since there are some things that he does not know, which are known to the Buddha. In fact, even if the Rigvedic seers claimed a direct revelation from Brahma, this lack of perfect knowledge on his part, according to Buddhism, would have constituted the Buddhist criticism of the complete veracity of this revelation. As for human omniscience, the criticism is not that there are certain things that a human teacher claiming omniscience does not know, but that there is no recluse or Brahmin who would know or see everything all at once, for such a thing is impossible. Sakideva, meaning all at once. It is said that the Buddha makes this observation with good reason, but the reason is not given anywhere in the Pali texts. And far from it being expressly denied, the possibility is in fact indirectly granted that with the above qualification, there can be a person who can claim to be omniscient. Can be omniscient. I won't go into that in too much detail, but the teacher who claims to be omniscient constantly and continually at all times, whether asleep or awake, is criticized on the grounds that his lack of omniscience would be evident from his actions. For instance, he enters an empty house and receives no alms. A dog bites him. He meets a fierce elephant, horse, or bull. He has to ask for the names of people, of villages and hamlets, or to find his way. The text is aware that these criticisms can be met by the rejoinder that all of these eventualities were inevitable but foreseen. And one of the religions thus criticized is undoubtedly Jainism. Anyway, so the Buddha certainly had a position that it is possible to expand knowledge to a degree that seems incredible to our ordinary limited understanding. And the whole purpose of Buddhism and the practice of Buddhism is to expand our knowledge in that way and to become to understand and have wisdom for things that just seem incomprehensible to us. And yet at the same time, the Buddha did acknowledge these limits to what we can know. I think we saw last week about the limits of knowing the first beginning of samsara and the origin of all things is one of the things that the Buddha did not claim to know. And other questions like whether the universe is finite or infinite, and so on, were also questions that the Buddha did not claim to have some kind of knowledge over. I think it's also pertinent to notice, and we might encounter this later on, but the Buddha never claimed to be able to see the future. And all of the claims of prophecies that the Buddha made are claims that exceed the claims that the Buddha himself made. The Buddha could predict the future in a limited sense through the understanding of causes and conditions. If such conditions are met, then such eventualities would happen. But that's a kind of prediction of the future that any of us can make with the right information. And it's not a kind of power of just being able to foretell the future. All right, so thus far we have a discussion of attitude towards authority. We've been going for a while now. Let us have 5 minutes meditation, a bit of a break, after which I will have a look at the chat and we will see how we're going for questions. Okay, so let's just do some meditation for 5 minutes or so. Have a bit of a look at the chats. What have we got here? Thanks. Great. Oh, really? Okay, so Chaitanya has given us a update on that. That was Basham's PhD thesis done in London. Then he came to ANU. My apologies. I thought it was done at ANU. Oh, well. So as the British won that one then. Okay, but I mean, that was back in the glory days when ANU was, I guess that was becoming one of the great centers of Buddhism, Buddhist studies in the world, actually. It lasted for a while. So Pravin asks a question, it's an interesting one. To what degree can we say moral character is its own category of epistemological authority within early Buddhism? I mean, I don't think we could say that moral character is its own category of epistemology, but it's certainly a relevant quality for epistemology. I mean, clearly, if we're relying on what somebody says, then if we can't rely on them to tell the truth, then we're in trouble. And this is, I think, one of the areas, like it's an interesting area that we're in today because we put so much of our words and deeds onto the internet. And the internet is very harsh. Digital media is very harsh. Why? Because normally the past is kind of fuzzied up with memory. And the internet keeps everything very clear. What you said last week, last year, the year before, 10 years ago, there it is. They're your words. That's what you said. And that kind of thing where our past sort of disappears hazily and we can forget about who we were, and then it comes back up. This is what we were and this is what we did. And that changing relationship with time, I think, is ultimately the biggest difference that the internet and digital technologies are making from a psychological point of view, that they change what memory is and they change what our character is and our relationship with time. So it's an interesting conversation, and it's obviously crucial in Buddhism, but I wouldn't say it's its separate category. Yes. So iPad says, greetings to everybody. Hello, iPad. And so Geraldine asks, isn't enlightenment omniscience, or is there a difference for the experiencer? No, enlightenment is not omniscience, and this is a point that the Buddha was making. So one of the things to understand here is, what's the point of enlightenment? Is the point of enlightenment to know everything? I mean, to know the bus schedule for tomorrow, or to know the particular configuration of a molecule that's floating around Alpha Centauri at the moment? Is that part of what spiritual enlightenment is about? Omniscience, when you start to think it through, is like really impractical, like all of that processing power going to knowing all of this really dumb and meaningless stuff. Like, why would you want to know all of those things? The Buddha said that his knowledge is about understanding suffering and the ending of suffering. That's the point, because that's our problem. So everything within Buddhism is always framed within that sphere. Now, this is something which changed over time, and it seems that in ancient India, because many different religious traditions had this idea of omniscience, whether according to the Brahmins it was the omniscience of God, or whether according to, say, the Jains or Adivikas it was the omniscience of their teacher. And perhaps the Buddhists felt that they need to keep up with the Jainses, keeping up with the Joneses, the Jains. I'm sorry. They had to keep up with everybody. They had to keep up with everybody else. So you find this idea of omniscience coming into Buddhism, and this idea that the Buddha like literally knew everything about everything that's happening in the whole kind of all of the universes. And that's sounds exhausting to me. It doesn't sound free of suffering at all. And there is a kind of more limited sense of omniscience, which is, I kind of glossed over that when I was discussing it, but there's another more limited sense of omniscience, which is that one might know whatever it is that one wants to know. So the Jain sort of strong omniscience is that you know everything all the time. And so a smaller sense of omniscience is that you know whatever it is you want to know when you know it. And you might have a bit of a stronger case for arguing that the Buddha was omniscient in that sense, although I think that's probably even a bit too strong, but it's certainly sort of closer to what the Buddha was claimed for himself. All right, so yes, Basham was Foundation Professor of Oriental Civilizations at ANU, yeah. It'd be interesting, like I don't know the history of that, like how it came to be that ANU had such a strong Buddhist studies department for many years. So it must be, I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe it was Basham who started it, I'm not sure. Okay. Okay, so Daniel asks, part of right view is that some beings are spontaneously reborn, right? So Daniel's referring here to the standard definition of right view. And so one of the definitions of right view is simply understanding the Four Noble Truths. And another part of the definition of right view is understanding about karma and rebirth. And part of karma and rebirth is that there are these different dimensions and different realms in which beings are born. At some realms, like our human realm, are born through a process of organic birth. Some, according to the suttas, are through a process of spontaneous rebirth, which is like devas or hungry ghosts or something like that. You just pop, there you are. And how do we know this? Good question. And we'll come more into like looking at the specifically Buddhist ways of knowing things, but I would say that we know that through the suttas, so through Pitaka Sampada. We might know it through reason to a certain degree, and we might also know it through experience, if we have that kind of relevant experience. So that there are certain things in Buddhism that are accessible to there are certain, the teachings of the Buddha are accessible to direct experience. The things that matter in Buddhism are accessible to personal experience, but that doesn't mean that they're accessible to everyone, because the world is subtle and it's hard to know. And the same thing is true of sciences. You know, everything in physics is empirically testable, at least in principle, but that doesn't mean that you or I can prove whether quantum theory is correct. I mean, in theory you can, but you know, you've got a lot of work to do before you're going to be in a position where you can really put that to the test. So empirically testable doesn't just mean that, you know, anyone can do it just by, you know, just easily. But through meditation, the Buddha said that if we go deeply enough in meditation, we can see the reality of these things, or we can test it according to evidence to some degree at least. So it's not necessarily that we can arrive at an absolute certain knowledge of these things, but at least we can have some understanding of them. Okay, so from Mitchell, a rather long question. Does early Buddhism take its central case of knowledge to be knowledge of, for example, the Four Noble Truths, the knowledge of the Buddha allegedly gained in the night of his enlightenment? Does early Buddhism not consider the nuances of knowledge that is not related to the path towards awakening? Generally speaking, yes, that's true, only considered in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Knowledge of laws of gravity, medical knowledge, and so on. That's correct. Jaitileka does not seem to specify if he's talking about the Buddhist position on knowledge generally or a certain kind of knowledge. And this seems to me to introduce confusion. I wish this was clear. This question is particularly pertinent to the critique of reason as a means of knowledge. Yeah, good point. Well, let's have a look later as we go along. Let's see if Jaitileka does bring that up. Surely he must. I can't recall off the top of my head, but surely he must discuss that somewhere. But we'll see if that comes up later. I'll certainly bear that in mind. But yes, generally speaking, when the Buddha was talking about means of knowledge, he was talking about means of knowledge relating to the Four Noble Truths. And one of his critiques of some of these other forms of knowledge was that they were irrelevant. So the knowledge claims sometimes might be true or false, but in other cases, they might also be irrelevant. Like it's irrelevant to know if the universe is infinite or not. It doesn't affect our own spiritual progress. Okay. Yes, so Cicero Rodrigo gives a reference to Kalama Sutta and also to the Chunky Sutta, yes. And Chunky Sutta is referred to in Jaitileka, and we will come to it at some point. But yes, the Chunky Sutta is probably the most, if you want to have a single text that can give you a really practical and useful way of understanding the ways of knowing in early Buddhism, the Chunky Sutta would probably be the best text. Okay, so Anne asks, Bhante, as to her limited understanding, there are two kinds of knowledge. Knowledge as to make the sense of self solidified, and knowledge to liberate the sense of self and conceit. And this knowledge of liberation, is it called supramundane? Supramundane knowledge, isn't it the same as omniscient knowledge? Okay, so again, omniscient knowledge is got nothing to do with whether you are free. Right? Being free is about not having craving and attachment, and it's about seeing the ways in which your own mind is holding on to things and creating suffering for yourself. It's got nothing to do with knowing the bus schedules in Paraguay. It's got nothing to do with knowing the chemical compositions of the oceans on Neptune. It's got nothing to do with any of those thousands and trillions and quadrillions of facts and details about the world, which are not bearing upon our spiritual liberation. So knowledge, what the Buddha called supramundane knowledge is Lokuttara knowledge, What it really means is knowledge that's leading beyond the world, or knowledge leading beyond rebirth. So knowledge that's leading towards letting go. Okay, but just more generally on that point that you made, that the distinction between knowledge that's building up a self and knowledge that's leading away from it. In a way, that distinction is somewhat orthogonal to the means that we're discussing today, in the sense that, if you look at the tradition, reason, experience, that these are all part of the non-Buddhist traditions. They're all talking about these things. They weren't invented by the Buddha. The Buddha adopted these and applied them in his own way. So you can use these three things to lead towards entrapment, or you can use them to lead towards liberation. Right? So it depends not on what these three things are in and of themselves, but on how they're understood and implied within the context of your spiritual practicing. Okay. Then Sankhara. Okay. So I'm guessing Venerable Katesha, Sira. It's given me a direct message question. It's a little bit off topic, Venerable. I might leave that one, asking about feeling, and it's a good question, but just conscious a bit of the time here. All right. So we're now about 4:20. I'm wondering at this point, we can either, would you like to do some breakout groups and have a bit of a discussion, or would you like to continue on with the next chapter on the attitude to reason? I'm not sure which one you're going to want, because I'm thinking we're probably going to run out of time for doing both. What do you reckon? Maybe a short breakout group? Anyone have any thoughts? Continue, next chapter, continue.
We have till 5 o'clock, Bhante. Class finishes at 5.
Not
4:30.
Yeah, I know.
Please.
Okay, everyone says to continue. All right. Okay. Next. All right, okay, I hear you. Never let it be said that I just ignore everybody. Okay, so next one, the attitude to reason. So remember, coming back to the 10 means given in the Kalama Sutta. Then we had 6, which were about reliance on authority. And the remaining 4 are about different kinds of reason, right? Or different ways of using reason. And so this next chapter, Jayatileka is having a bit of a look at these different four different ways and seeing how they work and what they mean. I'll just begin by reading through paragraph 313. In this chapter, we propose to examine the Buddhist attitude to reason as employed by their opponents. This involves an investigation into the grounds on which the Taki were criticized, and thus entails inquiry as to who the Taki or Takika were. Were they a class of... So Taki, meaning, Jayatileka will go on to discuss it, meaning like reasoners or rationalists or philosophers or something like that. Interesting kind of detail is that in early Buddhism, the seat of learning was always Takasila, which was in Gandhara, I think in what is now Afghanistan or Pakistan, I think Afghanistan. And that Takasila literally means the rock of reason. That's where, according to in the Jatakas especially, you see all of the Brahmin students would go to learn and to study. Okay, so were they a class of sophists who employed fallacious reasoning for destructive purposes, merely to outwit their opponents in debate without having any theories of their own, aka trolls? So we're looking at the origin of the great modern tradition of trolling. and different variations which you find today, like the sea lions and many others who Gillian could tell you about in a lot of detail as moderator of a forum. So this is one aspect of reasoning, is that there are a lot of people who use reason purely for spurious means. And of course, Jayatilleke Lake is using the sophists here as his example of the spurious reasoners. Again, as I talked about last week, is sort of harking back to ancient Greece and that kind of context. Interestingly enough, the sophists, I'm not an expert in it by any means, but my understanding is that the sophists have had a bit of a rehabilitation of their image in recent years. And the criticism of the sophists we know comes from Socrates, who it turns out was sponsored by Sparta, the military dictatorship. And so he was able to tell people that they shouldn't be selling their skills for money. They shouldn't get paid for doing philosophy. But of course, he was getting his money from basically from the fascists of the time. And meanwhile, the sophists were getting a bit of coin for doing some teaching, and he was very much against that. So perhaps the sophists weren't as bad as all that. Anyhow, but certainly we know the type, right? We know that there are people who use reason merely to confuse things, or made the semblance of reason to confuse things, to create chaos, to create distinction, to create division, to create an aura of knowing. Or, on the other hand, were they thinkers who made a rational defense of their theories, or even rational metaphysics who founded speculative theories on the basis of reason? Or is the word taki used in a wider sense to include and refer to both of these cases of people? So we're going to have a look and see how taki is used, and how sincere were the people who were engaging in these things. I mean, one thing to bear in mind, I think, when considering in ancient India, is that there was a lot of skin in the game compared to modern times. Like modern times, you can just leave a comment somewhere, you can throw out your opinions, you can do a YouTube clip or whatever, and it doesn't cost you anything. Whereas most of these people were, I mean, they'd given up everything. They'd gone forth, they were devoted their lives to things. It doesn't mean to say that they were necessarily right, but it does mean to say that there's a level of commitment behind what they were saying that suggests that it's more than mere dilettantism. One of the things that I would say, my personal observation about reason is that I find it surprisingly rare. I find reason to be surprisingly rare, and it's something that's taken me a long, long time to sort of understand and to come to grips with. I think that when we are at school or at university, we learn a very narrow operational way of using reason that we can apply in a certain context. And if you're a mechanic, you learn how, well, there's this noise, I'm going to trace that back to the source, I'm going to fix it, and you learn how to apply reason in that context. If you're a doctor, you learn how to apply reason in your context. If you're an accountant or an architect or an engineer, you learn to apply reason in your context. And we kind of assume, I think, that will kind of spill over into being able to apply reason more generally in life. And I don't necessarily think that that's the case. In fact, one could even argue that the opposite is the case, that since part of our life, part of our mind, right, part of our conscious life is about rationality, that when we have been using our rationality in that way, it's kind of a relief to not do it. And understandably, right? I mean, I feel that way too. Like if I'm doing, some work that requires intellectual activity, like doing my translation and things like that, then I'm happy to be able to leave that aside and go and do some meditation where I can just find some peace. It's nice to not have to think rationally all the time. And so I think that we somehow blithely assume that educating people in using rational means within a particular sphere is going to be a generalizable skill. And I think for many people it isn't, or it certainly isn't to the degree that we might hope. So this is why, we find educated, intelligent people who are perfectly rational within their field, believing and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Anyway. Okay, so let's go on now to section number 214, and we'll look at the 4 kinds of means of reason that Jayatilleka refers to, and that are extracted from the list in the Kalama Sutta and elsewhere. And they are Taka Hetu, so Taka Hetu being reason and rationality, Akara Parivitakena. Okay, Akara Parivitakena. Oh, sorry, number 2, I'm reading it out of order. Number 2, Naya Hetu. Okay, so Naya is a kind of a method or system. Akara Parivitakena is reasoning, reflective, something like reflective or contemplative reasoning. So parivitaka, vitaka means thought, parivitaka meaning comprehensive or reflective thought that's going more deeper into it. And so akara in this sense means a reason. And Ditti Nidjhana Kanti is the last one. And in this context, Ditti is a view. Nidjhana means pondering or reflection or contemplation. So nidjhana is distinct from jhana. It's the same root, but distinct. So in this case, it means pondering. And kanti is a word that you're probably more familiar with in the sense of patience and acceptance, but it also has the sense of acceptance of a view or believing in a view, believing in an idea. This is an important one to notice because these 2 senses often become confused, even in translations. And a lot of the times I see translations in even like ancient Chinese translations, where they will translate kanti as patience, whereas in fact it means acceptance of a view. Excuse me, just getting my robe back on. There we go. Okay, so kanti. Okay, so Jayatilleka continues. Just as Anusava played a predominant role in the list of 6, taka seems to be the key word here. The commentary explains taka hetu as taka gahena, which may be translated as either by comprehending reasons or by adhering to logic. But gahena is not semantical equivalent of hetu, and a more literal translation would be on the grounds of taka, on the grounds of reason. Okay, so taka hetu is the first one, which is on the grounds of reason. So we can, Jayatilleka points out quite rightly that we can't say, we can't evaluate the worth or the value of reasoning without knowing the kinds of reasoning that people were doing. And one of the things that we find in the suttas is that there is a wide variety of different people who are characterized as using reason in different kinds of ways. Now, Jayatilleka again goes on to quite a complex discussion of these things, which again, I won't go through in all of the details. And he looks at the occurrences of different kinds of words relating to reasons, reasoners and rationalists, both in the suttas and in the pre-Buddhist or non-Buddhist traditions. And I will just look at a couple of examples of this without going to look at all of the details. Okay. So he looks at there was a proposal, classificatory proposal by a scholar, German scholar called Hermann Oldenburg, and Jaitileka uses that as a starting point for an examination of the different kinds of views. I'm just going to pick one or two examples at random because otherwise it will get too long. So I'm going to go, let's start at paragraph 327. Let us now examine the theories which Oldenburg thought constituted the beginnings of a logical skepticism to see what their logical and epistemological foundations were. The reference is evidently to the three kinds of theories about views Dithi mentioned in the Digha Naka Sutta, and which are as follows. Sabbang me kamati, and again we have kamati as the verb form of kanti in the sense of an acceptance of a view. I agree with every view. Sabbang me na kamati, I agree with no view. Ekachang me kamati, ekachang me na kamati, I agree with some views and disagree with others. And in Majjhima Nikaya, it is said that those who firmly hold and dogmatically assert that any one of these theories is alone true and the others are false, is likely to engage in a contentious debate with their other two opponents, which results in dispute, vexation, and worry. So notice one of the things that we find quite commonly in the suttas is the idea, idameva satchang mogamanyang. This alone is the truth, everything else is silly. And this is said to be a dogmatic assertion, ida satcha binivesa. And so the idea that one can insist on a kind of like overly insist you can feel in that phrase like this kind of defensiveness to it. It's not merely saying that this is true, it's saying this alone is true and everything else is false. So once you get to that kind of overly aggressive, this overly kind of defensive attitude towards the truth, it's a sign that this is based on your conceit rather than being based on any valid means of knowledge. All right. So the Buddha notes, again, on paragraph 328 of Jaitileka, the Buddha speaks well of the second point of view, that is, I agree with no view, sabbang me na kamati, as tending towards dispassion. Interesting, right? And lack of attachment, whereas the first and third views have the opposite qualities. When he said this, Diganaka, his interlocutor, is exceedingly pleased since it was his own view. But the Buddha goes on to explain that holding the second view dogmatically and clinging to it is as bad as holding the other views. So the view that, I don't have any view, right? The view that, I'm not attached to views. On the one hand, it's good, right? It's actually, okay, it's a step in the right direction. It's a good attitude because it's leaning towards non-attachment. But you hold on to that, and then that it becomes really hard to do. Nagarjuna actually makes a nice point on that many years later when he said that those who he's here to teach about emptiness, but those who attach to emptiness itself, they're completely incurable. And so, yeah, this is where, you can see this is where that attachment is very kind of seductive, right? So when you're like, oh yes, I'm not attached to views, yes, and it's like I find it like really annoying, because as soon as anyone says that they're not attached to views, you can be damn sure that they're attached to a lot of views, but because they're not aware of it, right? It's just projection, right? You're the one who's always attaching, and so they're not actually aware of the way that they're attaching to their own views. So there's a difference between the Buddha's like saying here is leaning towards dispassion and actual dispassion. Anyhow, okay, going on to further discuss this in paragraph 329. Jaitileka says, a distinction appears to be drawn between two ways of holding view number two, that is, I agree with no view. The first is to hold dogmatically to this view with the readiness to defend it against its contrary and contradictory. This involves not giving it up as a view and the possibility of changing it for another. Right? And this is really kind of important. This idea that you can let go of one view and then take up another view. And the very fact that you can change views is really important, because that itself is a positive sign, right? Because, you know, normally we attach to views and we can't give them up. So the fact that somebody is willing to change their view, and the fact that this is acknowledged, this is a kind of a good sign. On the other hand, if you're merely exchanging one attachment for another, then you still got a long way to go. But at the very least, being able to change your view is good. And this is, again, something that I think is important to acknowledge in our modern context and our modern discourse. Like coming back to what I said earlier about how the internet and digital media preserves the past, right, in black and white, things that were said, views that were done, opinions, and so on. And you can see, like, a lot of internet discourse is like, oh, I can take this thing that you said and I'll use that to prove that you're wrong, right? As if, you know, people don't change their minds, as if there's something wrong with being a different person now than you were 5 years ago. And this is going to become even more and more so because our digital histories are getting longer, and, you know, we're going to be faced with things that were said to us that we said, like especially for younger people growing up today, then all of the dumb things that they did when they were teenagers are potentially going to be preserved for the rest of their lives. You think about that. Imagine if all the things that you did as a teenager, I'm looking at you, Ankong, were preserved for the rest of your preserved for the rest. I'm only kidding. Were preserved for the rest of your life. I know. I'm looking at me. Okay, I'm looking at me. Anyway, so change is good, but change has to be done with a reason, right? So it's not whether someone's changed or held the same view or a different view, but why? If there's a reason to change, then we should be changing. The other way of holding number two, that is to say, nothing agrees with me, is to hold non-dogmatically and disinterestedly, giving up such a view with no possibility of changing it for another. As a result of which he does not enter into debate or defend any view, since he's disinterested in all views and does not suffer the consequence of debate. Okay. So then the Jayatilleka goes on to discuss the conversation between Dighanakha, the wanderer, and the Buddha in the Dighanakha Sutta. Dighanakha proposes, I hold the view that I disagree with every view. And the Buddha says, do you agree with that view that you hold, namely that you disagree with every view? And which is a very witty response. And then Dighanakha says, even if I agree with this view, it is all the same. Jayatilleka discusses this. The purpose of the Buddha's question, judging from the rest of the context, seems to be to elicit this information, though it gives the appearance of a dialectical trap in a paradox situation. Asserting, I do not agree with any view, is a paradox situation of the same logical type as saying everything I say is false, which appears to be false if true and true if false. And this actually is really interesting. This relates to something that I said last week in the talk. And in one of the things that I talked about was how this particular book emerges from a moment and a transition period in Western philosophy in the mid-20th century, where a number of philosophers and intellectuals from following different roads came to comparable conclusions about the limitations of knowing. And Heisenberg through the ambiguity theory, Wittgenstein through acknowledging the limits of knowledge, Turing through the halting problem, Alan Turing, and also Gödel, the mathematician. And Gödel, in fact, discussed these kinds of problems. A classic kind of paradox would be, everything I say is false. And it's one of those statements, when you think about it, the longer you think about it, the more confused you get. Hang on, if it's false, if everything you say is false, then is that what you just said is true? But if that's true, then it can't be that everything is false. So it's then false to say that everything I say is false. So then it must be true to say that everything you say is false. But then if that's false, then that's true. And that kind of keeps on going. And so what these are pointing to, and what these paradoxes are pointing to, is that there are fundamental limitations in our expression of false and true statements. Not every statement can be classified as a false and a true statement. And there are certain kinds of things which fall outside of that area. And it's really interesting. And I think it's drawing upon that Jayatileka is actually making this observation and pointing out that Diganaka's statement is of a similar kind. And this is one of those kind of really interesting insights, I think, that you find in Jayatileka's writings so often. So just true or false. For if I agree with the view that I do not agree with any view, then I'm agreeing with some view and my statement is false. Whereas if I do not agree with the view that I do not agree with any view, then I am contradicting myself. Diganaka's reply, in fact, amounts to saying that even if he agrees with this view, it still remains a fact that he does not agree with all other views. Since this is not followed up by an attempt to show that Diganaka is thereby making a false statement or is contradicting himself, the Buddha's rejoinder is not meant to be a criticism of Diganaka's point of view, but apparently intended to elicit the information as to whether he is dogmatically holding to this theory as he appears to be from the subsequent discussion. Okay, to B, on the other hand, is the view that the Buddha speaks well of. That 2B is the view that I can let go of all these views and not take up another view, which he ascribes to certain recluses and Brahmins. So it's an interesting interpretation. I'm not sure if I entirely agree with what Jayatileka is saying, but I'm not saying I disagree with it either, but it's a really interesting argument. So he's saying that the Buddha, when he was responding to Diganaka's statement, he wasn't trying to trap him in a paradox, but he was trying to get a certain kind of information from him about what his relationship was to his view. And so that's the kind of really kind of interesting, nuanced insight into the nature of some of these dialogues. And I think this is something which is, I think is really sort of philosophically acute. And also, I think it's a compassionate reading, because it's not looking at these things from a point of view of trying to prove or disprove things, but looking at it from a point of view of trying to understand what is the conversation between these people and how are they relating to each other. And that kind of compassionate and nuanced relating to suttas is something that I think that we really need to emphasize, because it's so easy to lose that, and so easy to fall into traps of either I'm again dogmatically asserting everything here is right, everything else is stupid, or else looking at them like with a fault-finding mind and being cynical and saying, oh, suttas are wrong, or they're boring, or these sort of things. And neither of those approaches are approaches that are fueled with wisdom. And also, you find a lot of approaches these days of looking at wisdom. I've talked a lot about having like poets and engineers in looking at suttas. And it looks, sometimes when people read suttas, they read suttas like database engineers, and they make SQL queries of the information. They're like, I'm going to extract this bit of information and then align it with that bit of information. And then if I put this bit of information together, then I can put these two in this way. And then, oh, look, I get the conclusion that I wanted to get. And that's, oh, what a surprise. It's almost as if that was predetermined by my method in the first place. And again, that's not a compassionate way of looking at things, right? So to look at it compassionately, and I think this reading, that particular paragraph of Jayatileka is a highly intelligent paragraph, but it's also a very compassionate paragraph, because he wants to listen to what these people want to say rather than to try to impose his reading on it. Yeah. Okay. So he goes on. Who would these recluses and Brahmins be who subscribe to the view sabbang me nakamati? I don't agree with anything, which among other things is said to be anupadanaya santike, close to non-attachment. It is very probable that there were no others than those who were the skeptics, amara vikepika, who valued mental tranquility, avoided debate, and anything that caused vexation, and among whom at least one school is said to have regarded non-skepticism as an attachment of which they were afraid and with which they were disgusted. That the so this is here Jayatileka is referring to statements in other suttas, specifically in the Brahmajala Sutta, where it talks about some who are regarded as the Amara Vikepika, either the endless equivocators or the eel wrigglers, depending on how you read that compound. They believed that involvement with a view was attachment. And so it was more peaceful to have no kind of view and to not be attached to any kind of view at all. And that's actually quite a nice little philosophy to have, right? Because it's so easy. Oh, I'm not attached to anything. The problem is that views are actually kind of useful. And there's actually, views are not kind of optional extras. Views are what allow us to shape the world in a coherent way and through a coherent set of values. And views give us a shorthand for dealing with things. So we don't have to work everything out from first principles every time. I mean, just give you a very simple example of that. If I have a view that say that killing is wrong, okay? Now, that means that when I see a cockroach in my flat, I don't say, is it right or wrong to kill this cockroach? Let me figure that out. What's the right thing to do here? What I say is, no, actually, I know killing is wrong. Let's see if I can get it out without killing it. And then the next cockroach is the same thing. And the next cockroach is the same thing. That's what views do. They give our mind a shape and a form and a framework that allow us to operate without having to figure out everything from first principles every time. So views are essential, but the question here is, what is our relation to our views? How tightly do we hold them? I can believe that killing cockroaches is bad, but if cockroaches are infesting a cupboard that's giving diseases to children, is that should I still put up with them? And that's not going to be an easy question to answer. And so there's a difference between having no view and holding the views lightly. Okay. So this is the Amara Vikepika, those who say, I don't have any views, I don't have any attachments, and I don't agree with anything. So, you know, when you hear these kinds of things, people saying these things in Buddhism, which you do, then you should recognize, these are the Amara Vikepikas. Views are good, but they need work. Sometimes it's just laziness that we don't want to really question our views. Anyway, okay. So Jayatileka goes on to discuss the school to which Diganaka adheres and so on, and I won't go into that too much. That will, again, just lead us a little bit too far astray. I'm going to skip forward. 50. Okay, I'm going to skip forward. I don't have that much time left, but I'm going to skip forward to so Jayatileka talks about the culture of debate in the time of the Buddha, which is a prominent feature of these kinds of circles. And so and again, relates to that that quality of the Buddha's teachings, where he was so much having conversations with people who had a different idea than he did. But without going into too much detail as the debating, the questions of debating, I want to just look briefly at sorry, I'm just seeing if this yeah, no, actually, I will leave that bit behind. That's going to take too long to discuss at this point. I was going to go into more some of the logical patterns of reasoning that Jayatileka discusses in paragraphs 350 to 359, but I think I'm running out of a bit of time to do that, so I will leave that aside. Okay, so I want to return just to briefly sum up, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to talk more about this chapter, but just to come back to the that set of four ideas at the beginning: takahetu, nayahetu, akara parivitakena, nijjhana kantiya. And I defined these briefly before. Takahetu is based on reason. Nayahetu is based on a system. Akara parivitakena is reflecting, is reasonable or rational reflection. Nijjhana kanti is acceptance of a view after pondering. Now, these four things seem to have a graduated sense. They move towards a deeper and more reflective kind of understanding. And so the takahetu is more strictly rational. The nayahetu relying on some kind of system. So naya became one of the great schools of Indian philosophy and generally refers to the development of a methodology or a systematic way of analyzing questions. And so if you look at what that means within Buddhism, for example, you have the Abhidhamma, which developed these kinds of systems. So you could take a problem, break it up, and analyze it in the same kind of way. A book like, say, the Katawattu, which has a discussion of problems of doctrinal points in Buddhism, is a good example of Nayahetu, because it uses a methodology to break up questions, use questions and answers, and to arrive at the results of problems through following that kind of system. So this seems to be an application to what Nayahetu is. So it's a bit different from just using rational argumentation, because with Nayahetu you have a particular system to use. Then Akara Parivitakena is, I think it is deeper in the sense that the idea of Parivitaka involves a more contemplative reflection. And akara also has a sense, it means a reason, but it also has a sense of like looking at different aspects of things. Akara can mean an aspect of things or different parts of things. So akara parivitakena is much more like a deep and systematic analysis of all of the component parts and aspects of something. And again, to me, that's a deeper form of reasoning, because like the first one, takahetu, is it can be very kind of operational. It can be like, oh, I'm just going to get the kind of result that I need, and I'm just going to do this. And same with nayahetu, I'm going to apply this method. And the nayahetu, I think, is like what I was saying before about almost like professional logic. Like if you're an engineer or you're an accountant or something like that, you learn a system that you can apply logic and get the answer that you need for that case. But you don't like necessarily really understand what's going on. And so the akara parivitakena, I think, is more about like a deep level contemplative understanding of things. And the ditti nijjhana kanti is more the outcome of that process. So with the ditti nijjhana, after pondering, after contemplating something deeply, then there is an acceptance of that. And as we've said, acceptance of view can be either attached to or not attached to. So these are different aspects of reason, again, all of which are useful, all of which are part of how our mind works. It's not that these things are right or wrong, but if we overly attach and overly insist on one or other of them, then we will be led down the path of dogmatic insistence on a view. Ira sachabini vesa. All right, so we have a few minutes left, and I will just take a few more questions while I can. So please, if you have any questions, please pop them into chat. Right. Right. Yeah. So Sarah asked an interesting question about the way that knowing is shaped by biology in some ways. Like this, like we have an organic capacity for knowing depending on who we are, different species. There was a classic philosophical essay in the 70s, "What is it like to be a bat?" and trying to consider what the world of experience would actually be like for a bat. We'll see how we go. I'm not sure if we're going to look in detail at this, but let me just bear that in mind for now. Actually, one thing that I was thinking about more recently was the question of what is it like to be an AI? Like if you, like leaving aside the possibility of having, I don't believe that we have anything like real artificial intelligence or artificial consciousness. And I don't think that what we're doing now will lead to that. But if we just accept theoretically the possibility that you could have an artificial consciousness, what would it be like? What kind of experience would it be to have a purely digital awareness? There was one of the few really innovative articles on that was published recently, and it was very kind of powerful. I found a really powerful argument calling for a Butlerian jihad on AI. And for those of you who are fans of Dune will know what that means. And Enkong, you will know that, of course, as a science fiction geek from long back. But in the world of Dune, the people, advanced societies in the future had long abolished AI as an abomination. They felt that it was just a thing that shouldn't exist in the world. And this article was saying that we still have this concept of abomination, right? We just ban certain things because they are unnatural. Like you can't sew a human head onto a pig's body. You just can't. It's just illegal everywhere. It's an abomination. It's just unnatural. And he was saying that AI should be regarded in that same way. And it was a really powerful argument. And one of the arguments that he made, like he said, like we normally think of AI in terms of utilitarianism, like how useful is it going to be or potentially harmful is it going to be? But what about from the AI's perspective? I mean, is it possible that an AI is conceived for any other reason other than being a slave? Why else would you create an AI if not to just be a slave for you? And what kind of experience does an AI have? Like we assume that an AI uses cameras to see and microphones to hear, but what if it doesn't? What if it just lives screaming in agony on the chip without actually communicating with the outside world? That's kind of disturbing, right? We would never know. We could be creating all of these consciousnesses that are just howling into the abyss, but no one's actually hooked them up to a speaker, so we can't hear them howl. That's a somewhat disturbing thought, right? Anyway, I will move on. Okay. Sensory. Not being able to read the font clearly, I assume that says OWL and not AI. It's either an AI speaking to us or OWL. Don't the suttas also display an aggressive defensive theme of this alone can't be true, nothing else is silly? No, they don't. So the suttas have a kind of nuance around that. Yes, the suttas assert things are true, but they don't go to that extreme of dogmatic. The idea of Moghamanyang is not just that they are incorrect, but that it's fundamentally flawed way of thinking. Okay. Okay, so again, good question there from Pravin. So is a Dhamma as a principle to be distinguished from Dhamma as a view to the extent that a Dhamma operates whether or not one holds a view, but that a view may in fact obscure the ability to comprehend or experience a Dhamma? Yes, look, absolutely. And I think this is really important. And I think this happens in Buddhism all the time. When I talk to people who are meditators, one of the key red flags that I use is that when people talk to me, do not talk to me in Pali. Do not describe your experience in Pali. Oh, yes, well, I had this vitaka and this vichara and I got into this jhana and I did it. No. Talk to me in language. Talk to me about your experiences. Don't try to map your experiences onto some kind of doctrinal category that you think you understand. Right? I'm the teacher. It's my job to interpret and understand your experiences and to give you the guidance that you need. If your meditation is going well, you probably don't need any guidance. But I can't know that as long as you are just spouting a bunch of technical language at me. And I said this many, many times to people talking about meditation, and it's interesting. So most of the time people are okay, and then they talk about their experience and they say, this is what happened to me in my meditation and so on, and it's not a problem. Some people cannot do that. They look at you in a way that's like puzzled, and then they go on and they say the same thing again. I had this vitaka and this vichara, and I had this jhana, and I had this. No, don't use Pali words. Tell me about what your experience was. And they can't do it because they're so wrapped up in the Dhamma as a view that they are disconnected from the Dhamma as an experience. So this is one of the methods that I use as a meditation teacher to be able to tell when this kind of attachment is happening. So this is why we need to hold our Dhamma lightly. The Dhamma can help us in our meditation, but not if our whole meditation is spent trying to figure out how our experience fits into some understanding of some text. Re the Anattalakkhana Sutta, it's Buddha using the Nyaya method. Well, I mean, Nyaya is the same word as in the discussion of the Sangha, right? Nyaya Patipanno, so we practice according to the method. So, you know, in the Buddhist teaching, the dependent origination and eightfold path are the Nyaya, so in that kind of sense. Deduction. Korokot read an explanation somewhere that Takahetu is deduction, Nyahetu is induction. I'd have to think about that a bit. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not. I don't think so, but I'd have to see the context to say whether that's correct or not. I'm philosophically skeptical about the validity of that distinction between those two kinds of logic. Personally, I think deductive logic is merely inductive logic with the uncertainty hidden away in the assumptions. That's my view. Okay. Okay, so iPad's giving some comments on cockroaches. Thank you, iPad. Okay, so yes, Naya and Nyaya are from the same root, the same term. That's according to Vijita. So I'll leave that there. So a few other questions there, but I might just leave it for now. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thank you to the Buddhist Library for sponsoring this talk. We are going to have to wrap up now, unfortunately. It has been most enjoyable spending some time with you and with the Venerable Sangha members, Venerable Adisila, Venerable Analaya, Venerable Karunika, and I'm sure some other Sangha members around, and those people from all around the world who have come. And it is always interesting. And this was a project which I did, frankly, because I wanted to. And so I'm glad to find that there are some others who share my own interest. And I do hope that, you take the time to pick up some of what Daitileka is saying and to help you to understand what the Buddhist teaching is because of that. That would be my help. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. I look forward to seeing you again next week.
No class next week.
No, is there no class next week?
No, following week.
I will look forward to seeing you again the following week.
Yeah.
Okay, be happy.
See you. Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thanks, Andy. See you.